Hello, everyone. We're going to take a look at the Beatitudes again, and this is the third and final in our very brief video series about the 8 Beatitudes. And when we get to the end, we'll see why there are 8.5. So we are up to blessed are the pure in heart. That's in Matthew chapter 5, verse 8. Of course, all of these are in Matthew chapter 5 as part of the Sermon on the Mount. And purity of heart is actually a recurring theme in the Bible. And we see it played out in a variety of ways, including, for example, Psalm 24. The psalmists ask the question, who shall ascend the hill of the Lord and stand in his holy place? Those who have clean hands and pure hearts. So purity of heart goes back a very, very, very long ways. And in our culture, we often think of the heart as a seat of emotion. My heart was touched, or somebody who's soft-hearted or hard-hearted. But properly understood in the biblical era, heart really has to do with the inner core of our being, or the center of our soul. And the issue for purity of heart isn't just about outward behavior, but about our inner thoughts and our inner motivation and our inner feelings as well. And it's a reflection of the promise that the prophet Jeremiah makes of a new covenant. So if you look at Jeremiah chapter 31, the prophet says, "The days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people." So when you think about purity of heart, these days some people see that as a kind of moral purity, but it's so much more than that. A better modern understanding, I think, might be the notion of integrity. So blessed are those who have complete and pure integrity. And purity, let's remember, means clean, like grain, for example, that has been separated from the chaff or metal, purified by fire. And interestingly, purity can also refer to an army or a military outfit that has been purged of unfit soldiers. So it may be smaller, but it's stronger and more efficient. And purity of heart is also unmixed motives. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, who's one of my favorites, wrote a book entitled "Purity of Heart is to Will One Thing." So think about that sentence for a couple of hours. Purity of heart is to will one thing. Okay? How do you achieve that? Well, some people tend to think about right behavior or even right religion as a notion of you got the things you're supposed to do and the things you're not supposed to do. So you got do's and don'ts. Well, if you want to look at life that way, if you're worried that you might do the don'ts, then get busy doing the do's. Because if we spend our time and energy doing the things that God wants us to do, then we simply won't have any time left over to do the things God prefers us not to do. And we may not always feel like doing the right thing. So what? It doesn't matter what you feel like. You just do the right thing. A life of faith is not about feeling. And that's why purity of heart is really not about our emotional selves. Faith is a choice. I don't feel like mowing the grass, but I mow it every time it needs it anyway, regardless of how I feel. You may not feel like going to work, and get this, you might not feel like going to church, but get there anyway. Do the right thing. It's not about how you feel. It's about the choices that we make. And by the way, this is the only beatitude, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. That's a big deal in the ancient Near East, the notion of being able to see God. It was believed that no one could see God and live because God is so far above us, our minds would just be completely blown up. If you look at the Old Testament, you have people like Abraham, Moses, Isaiah, Elijah, and they kind of saw God, but only a little bit, or only the backside of God, or only the holiness of God. Thomas à Kempis, who was around in the Middle Ages, wrote, "If our hearts were pure, all of creation would become a book of holy doctrine." I love that. So if our hearts were pure, we would be able to see the holiness that is in every element of God's creation, including something of the image of God within every single human being. All right, moving on. Blessed are the peacemakers. Matthew chapter 5, verse 9. For they will be called children of God. So what is peace? Automatically, many people think of it as absence of armed conflict, world peace. But it's really better understood, I think, as the presence of wholeness and well-being. The blessed are the peacemakers isn't really so much about political peace or civil peace. In fact, no existing political system, no political solution fully embodies Christian teachings anyway. And Jesus never said anything about politics or forms of government. And if anything, he seemed disinterested about the whole thing. So it tickles me when people think that, oh, well, Jesus would certainly vote the way I vote. Have you ever noticed that? Jesus always votes the way you vote, regardless. That's just funny and a little absurd. So remember, early Christianity flourished under an oppressive and hostile government. Jesus did not say, blessed are those who take over the government and change society. He said, blessed are the peacemakers. So establishing or attempting to establish a civil peace is costly and extremely complicated. So what about peace as wholeness and well-being? Peacemakers can be seen as individuals who practice Jesus' commandment of love, loving your enemies, reaching out to the oppressed, reaching out to the disenfranchised, seeking wholeness in others, increasing well-being in others. Peacemaking requires active engagement in our world. And I like the promise that comes with peacemakers. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. So the promises that come with the Beatitudes seem to be getting better and better. Blessed are you who are hungry, for you will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for you will receive mercy. Then the other promise is you will see God if you're pure in heart, or if you're a peacemaker, you will be a child of God. It gets better and better all the time. This is about an intimate relationship that we have with the Lord. Okay, the last beatitude, or the last beatitude and a half, blessed are the persecuted. Matthew chapter 5, verse 10. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. All right, how many beatitudes are there? The very next verse, Matthew 5, chapter 11, blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. That sounds like another beatitude. So, chapter 5, verse 10 begins, blessed are. Chapter 5, verse 11, blessed are. So you have that formulaic repetition. Moving on in chapter 5, now verse 12, if you are persecuted falsely on my account, verse 12 says, rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way, they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So, what is beatitude number 8? Is it, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake? Or is it, then the next verse, blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account? Well, it doesn't really matter if you want to say there are 8 beatitudes or 9 beatitudes. I've heard split the difference and just say there are 8.5. The last verses all refer to the same thing, persecution. So once you get to chapter 5 of Matthew, beginning in verse 10 and verse 11 and verse 12, it's all about persecution. So if we seek to live our lives by the previous 7 Beatitudes, we will be persecuted, guaranteed. If we live by Beatitudes 1 through 7, we will receive number 8, persecution. Because the Beatitudes are the exact opposite of this world's logic. So if we live our lives and order our lives by the Beatitudes, it means we will live backwards from the world. And the world will notice that, and the world will see us as different and even perhaps a threat to the status quo, and we will be persecuted. Christianity is revolutionary, and persecution takes many different forms. It's incredibly sad, but even in the 21st century, there are countries in our world where Christians are actively persecuted, and that's horrible. But there's another kind of persecution that happens in the United States, being ignored. Think about it. The forces of the world have figured out that Christianity isn't going to go away. So it's a notion of keep your friends close and keep your enemies closer. So over time, Christianity was just kind of absorbed into society, and the more radical elements of Christianity have just been ignored. This kind of persecution may be the very worst that there is, to be deemed as irrelevant. Oh, you're a Christian. Okay, fine, whatever. It's not important. No one pays attention to Christians anymore. It's often said that if you're not stirring up some kind of trouble, then you're probably not really following Jesus. And let's be careful about what I mean by this. I don't mean that Christians need to be hateful and in your face about partisan politics. I mean that Christians need to live in a way that is opposite from the way of the world. We seek servitude, not control. We seek humility, not praise. We seek to serve the lowest and the least because that's where we find Jesus. Not we seek to be elbow to elbow with the movers and the shakers. See what I mean? It's one thing for a Christian to get all huffy and puffy and mean and hateful and nasty and make political statements that are partisan, but it's a whole other thing altogether for a Christian to live opposite the way of the world, where we give and share rather than take and keep. So if what we do as Christians doesn't shake things up a little, it's probably not worth doing. Sometimes, maybe even most of the times these days, the persecution that we face can come from other Christians. We face scribes and Pharisees from within. We cause problems for fellow Christians without realizing it. And according to the Beatitude, these persecutions in all their various forms are really blessings. Persecutions strengthen our faith. Persecutions help us discover the weak points within our faith. And so this Beatitude looks to the future for the heavenly reward, and it also looks to the past because it mentions the notion of the prophets who themselves were persecuted. Matthew 5 verse 12, rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So serving God isn't going to put us in the mainstream of society. It's going to make us look rather different. And people don't always respond well to that. And that's it. It's a very, very, very bird's eye view of the Beatitudes, I know, and I apologize for the shortness of all of that, but I hope you've been able to get something out of this brief video series. Thank you very much, and may God bless you.